Now, you're very well known for a piece of work you did with Vlada and Jola called the Anatomy of an AI System, in which you mapped the chain of materials, knowledge, and labor that went into the creation of the Amazon Echo device. And of course, Echo devices live in tens of millions of homes around the world. That piece of art has made it into the permanent collection of the MoMA in New York and the V&A in London. And it's a great way to understand your broad approach. Can you just tell us a little bit about that project and what it tells us about modern AI systems?
In so many ways, Anatomy of AI was a project that transformed my thinking about artificial intelligence. I mean, it's something that I've researched for almost coming on 20 years. But this project really gave me a completely different view, almost a nose to tail perspective of how we truly make artificial intelligence. And I mean that in its broadest sense. So this project began back in 2016, where Fladan and I were trying to map out what it takes to make a single voice-enabled AI system. So you might think of Amazon Alexa, or you might think of Siri or Cortana. And we decided to choose the Amazon Echo unit. What we did is we began by trying to think of every component that goes into an Echo and where those minerals come from. So we started to trace the mining supply chains. We looked at smelting. We looked at container shipping. We looked at all of the data pipelines where the data is harvested from these devices and interpreted. And then we looked at the end of life, where these devices are sort of thrown into e-waste tips in places like Ghana and Pakistan, generally in sort of fewer than 4 years from when they're purchased. So we're seeing sort of this sort of extraction of so much energy and minerals and labor that comes from billions of years of development in the earth to be used for a split second of technological time. So that project really changed my thinking, that we had to move away from this idea of artificial intelligence as being immaterial and abstract and in the cloud, if you will, to see it as a profoundly material technology, something that is made from the earth, from human bodies, and from huge amounts of data, of course.
The Alexa story is a great overview of your thesis, but at the heart of that lies a more abstract idea, which is to challenge this notion that intelligence is a thing on its own, that it is a problem to be solved. And you make a very compelling argument that the way that intelligence is thought of by the computer science community, the AI community, is quite problematic. What are the limits in the way that people who are developing these systems think about when they talk about intelligence?
Well, we could go right back into the history of artificial intelligence, back into the 1950s and 60s, where some of the earliest presumptions were that computers were like human brains and that we could effectively teach them to learn in a similar way. So there was this idea that in many ways, intelligence is something that is separate from embodiment. You could call this sort of classic Cartesian dualism of artificial intelligence, where minds are entirely separate from their connection to earthly bodies and states. But in so many ways, I see this as an original sin for the field, this idea that somehow computers were minds and that they were anything like human intelligence. It's an idea which has so profoundly shaped artificial intelligence and I think computer science more generally for decades. Whereas in actual fact, what we see, particularly with machine learning, is something that is very different to the way that humans think. We're looking at large scale statistical analysis and prediction and optimization, very different to the sort of ways in which humans are in the world and think in relation to each other, in relation to their environments. So in many ways, that pulling apart that idea of intelligence and bringing it back to earth, if you will, was a real motivation behind doing Atlas of AI.
There's an interesting idea that's wrapped up in there, which I think there's this notion that when we think of a superintelligence, it's often represented as not being embodied. So if you look at the science fiction, if you look at the way we talk about the modern machine learning systems like the GPT-3, which is a language system developed by OpenAI, they're always presented ultimately as being disembodied. There's this notion that perhaps it's embedded, that we start as little trilobites and then we become little fishes and then we walk on land and then we become little chimp-like things and then we walk upright and then we sort of disappear up into the cloud. Is there some sense in which this discipline has connected the idea of embodiment with the idea as a passing phase on our journey towards ethereality.
You can see that when, say, Elon Musk talks about wanting to upload his brain to the cloud. You see it when we hear about technologists who are saying that ultimately brains are really only storage devices and calculation devices. I think we lose so much in that vision of the world. And again, I think it belies the ways that humans actually engage with each other and in societies. So certainly that trajectory model is something that I would really question. But it's interesting too, if you go back to history, you can see how this idea of intelligence sort of reflects its time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking here of a particular horse by the name of Clever Hans.
Right.
Now, Clever Hans was, seen as this sort of miraculous horse at the turn of the 20th century because he was seen as intelligent. He could respond to queries like, what is 2 + 2? And he would tap out the answer with his hoof. And this was the absolute toast of the town, and he would do performances in public. But there ultimately, people had questions like, what kind of intelligence is this? And there were inquiries. And it was found that his trainer was in fact giving subconscious signals about what the correct answer would be. And in that story was this sort of moment where intelligence was seen and recognized and celebrated. And then it was questioned. What we're actually seeing was a person really giving all of the clues to this animal. And that idea, this idea of the Clever Hans phenomenon, is now used in machine learning to describe how we often have training data sets that are overfitted to a problem, that you've ultimately created a training data set that will predetermine your answer. And so in many ways, we're seeing that Clever Hans phenomenon play out time and time again in artificial intelligence, where we are creating the ground truth, if you will, by using large-scale training data sets that will produce a worldview that we've already thought about. We're getting the answers, if you will, that we already know. So I think we have to be very skeptical about these forms of intelligence making and see them as products of their time.